Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
President Trump has said the age limit for buying all guns should be 21 years. By tomorrow, that may have changed. Anyone looking for consistency from America's Commander-in-Chief on one of the most critical issues of the age may be shortchanged. Last night, just before we came on air, he declared schools could be safer if certain teachers were armed. This morning, he denied it in a tweet. By this evening, it was back on the cards, a great deterrent, he confirmed. For those American students who demand change, showing a maturity and a commitment to ending school mass murder that may put their elders to shame, the mixed messages will offer nothing but frustration. The financial and electoral power of many of Americans' legislators lies in the hands of the National Rifle Association. Today, their chief told the Conservative Conference the anti-gun lobby was socialists intent on taking away American freedoms.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name.
He prayed, and then he listened.
I was born into a world where I never got to experience safety and peace.
And I don't understand why I could still go in a store and buy a weapon of war.
I'm from Stoneman Douglas High School, and I was there during the shooting, and I'm a survivor.
This was the chance for the president to show he got it, even if it did require a crib sheet to remind him what to say. He heard from a father who'd lost his daughter in the Florida shooting and vowed America must change.
We're here because my daughter has no voice. She was murdered last week. We go to the airport. I can't get on a plane with a bottled water, but we leave it. Some animal could walk into a school and shoot our children.
And from a girl who asked for the conversation to become less polarised, more open to thoughtful debate.
Everybody right now is so stuck on what they believe that they're not even listening to what other people believe.
And then, after an hour or so of listening, the president spoke. This is what he said.
It's called concealed carry, where a teacher would have a concealed gun on them. They'd go for special training, and they would be there, and you would no longer have a gun-free zone.
It was the only line anyone would quote. This morning, it transpired he hadn't said it at all. It was simply the fake old media that had got it wrong, again. By tonight, he decided maybe he had said it. Anyway, it was a jolly good idea. A great deterrent. The NRA agreed. No surprises there, perhaps. Their chief, Wayne LaPierre, put his finger on the real culprit, socialism.
You should be anxious, and you should be frightened. If they seize power, if these so-called European socialists take over the House and the Senate, and God forbid they get the White House again, our American freedoms could be lost and our country will be changed forever. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that, don't forget, is the voice of financial power in America. They backed the president to the tune of $30 million. Does he have the appetite to bite that hand? Well, joining us now is John R. Lott Jr., president of the Crime Prevention Research Centre. John R. Lott, very good to have you on Newsnight this evening. Thank you for joining us. Can I just start by asking you what you felt and heard from those students who were talking to President Trump yesterday in the White House? Were you moved?
Well, I think anybody's moved. I guess the question is, what's going to happen? What's the impact of the different laws that they want to have put in place? I mean, we've had people talking about background checks on private transfers. That's kind of been the #1 thing that people have been asking for. But I can't think of any attack this century that would have been stopped in any way if that type of law had been in effect. You know, we want to do something. I want to do something, but you want to do something that will actually be relevant for these attacks. And I think the president, who I think has been very consistent on this about allowing staff or teachers to be able to go and carry permit concealed handguns
Right.
is on the right track there.
So you would arm teachers in schools, would you? So if you wanted highly skilled teachers, they would have to be top marksmen and women as well as teachers.
Right. Well, you have 25 states to varying degrees currently allow teachers or staff to be able to go and carry. You don't need very many, just a few at each place. I mean, the alternative is to go and, let's say, have an armed guard. The problem with having an armed guard is that having somebody in uniform is like having somebody with a neon sign above them that says, "Shoot me first."
So
You know,
better to
whether
have
it's-
teachers then, better to have teachers that have to be marksmen, that have to be a sort of SWAT team in the schools. And Trump said today they would get a bonus if they were armed. Is that the route you would go down?
Look, we've had, in just the last few years, we've had dozens of mass public shootings that have been stopped by concealed carry permit holders. There's really not much difference here. You have about 17 million Americans that have permits to carry concealed handguns. These individuals are extremely law-abiding, and the types of concerns, even in the states that currently have teachers or staff, you don't see any problems with them.
Would it be just teachers, or would it be other members of staff? Would you even arm the children, perhaps? I mean, it's a race to the bottom at that point, isn't it?
I think that's a little absurd. What do you think, like 2-year-olds will be armed?
I'm asking
the point
you.
is, yeah, well, the point is you'd have adults, okay, who have gotten additional training. And as I say, we have 25 states. If you can point to one problem, any significant problem, I know of one accidental discharge of a gun in all the years that different states have had these types of rules, and nobody was harmed. But beyond that, what you find is that these people are very law-abiding. They haven't had the problems. And one thing is clear, is that none of those places that have allowed staff or teachers to have permit concealed handguns have had these types of attacks. It's one thing to put a sign in front of a building that says, "This is a gun-free zone," and another one to say people are...
John, look, I get that, and I get that the British culture has a very different take on this, and this is why we're interested in your view. But fundamentally, America loses some, 96 people on average every month of every year to gun crime. And it doesn't seem worth considering other issues like background checks, like bump stock bans, like proper mental health checks, like any of the things, or stopping selling guns to people under 21. Why wouldn't you incorporate any of those first?
Well, we have background checks. There's a lot of academic literature on that, and unfortunately, it doesn't find that they reduce crime in any way. I mean, think of it this way. How easy is it for you to go and find illegal drugs? I mean, you go to college and you ask the students, 80% or so will say that they can easily get it. The same groups that sell illegal drugs are the same ones that sell illegal guns. I mean, if I were to click my fingers and cause all illegal drugs to disappear from the United States and all guns, how long do you think it would be before the drugs started coming back in? 20 minutes? And how long do you think it would be before those same drug gangs started bringing in guns to protect that valuable property?
Do you believe, as the NRA chief suggests today, that those calling for gun safety laws were socialist, politically motivated to seize America's freedom? Is that how you think?
Well, my big concern about the gun control laws is that they basically disarm the most vulnerable people in our society. You look at I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. It costs $125 to go and do a background check on a private transfer of a gun here.
Okay.
Who do you think you price out of being able to go and protect themselves and their families? It's basically poor minorities who live in high-crime urban areas.
Thank you very much.
It'd be great if the...
Thank you very much.
It'd be great.
Good to hear your thoughts.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
President Trump says the solution to stopping another school shooting in America is more guns. He told supporters that students need to be better protected on campuses, and arming teachers and sports coaches would be a major deterrent. The president also criticised the police deputy who waited outside Parkland School in Florida while 17 pupils and teachers were shot dead. is our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore.
The new startling revelation is that the Florida school had an armed officer with the mission of protecting the children, but that he failed to confront the gunman, leaving it to the SWAT teams that arrived too late.
I've been a police officer for 30 years.
Officer Scott Peterson, seen here at a school board meeting a few years ago, has now resigned. Security cameras showed him taking cover. Even if he was outgunned, the county sheriff says it was a disgrace that Peterson didn't try and intervene.
What I saw was a deputy arrive at the west side of Building 12, take up a position, and he never went in.
Given how long it took police to track down Nicholas Cruz, the sheriff is in no doubt what Peterson should have done.
Went in, addressed the killer, killed the killer.
Now the president and the gun lobby are using it to reshape the debate away from gun control and towards one officer's inaction.
They're trained. They didn't react properly under pressure, or they were cowards. It was a real shot to the police department.
The president then gave a speech to his core supporters that included some truly bizarre moments.
I try like hell to hide that bald spot, folks. I work harder.
But he soon returned to his idea of arming up to 20% of America's teachers, saying those weapons could be hidden.
And the beauty is it's concealed. Nobody would ever see it unless they needed it. It's concealed. So this crazy man who walked in wouldn't even know who it is that has it. That's good. It's not bad, that's good. And a teacher would have shot the hell out of him before he knew what happened.
He shares the view of the NRA that guns are not so much the problem as the solution.
When we declare our schools to be gun-free zones, it just puts our students in far more danger.
All of that is likely to dismay the powerful movement of students demanding a fundamental change to American gun laws. Robert Moore, ITV News, Washington.
First there was Columbine, then Sandy Hook. Now this pretty town in Florida is the latest to add its name to America's roll call of mass school shootings. This is Parkland, where a week ago a young man armed with an assault rifle massacred 17 people, 14 of them students at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. Today we'll be speaking with 6 students and one of their teachers about that tragedy and their movement to change the nation's gun laws that has grown from their grief and their anger. Now, already the president, though, seems to have determined his course. Speaking on stage at a conservative conference in Maryland, he's declared the benefits of arming teachers, a move the gun lobby has long desired. After days of funerals, vigils and protests, the teachers of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High returned to work this morning. It's only been a week since 17 students and staff were murdered in their corridors and classrooms. Nicholas Cruz has been charged, described as a troubled kid who'd been reported repeatedly to the authorities. 3 months ago, a family friend called police. She'd thrown him out of her house because he'd pointed a shotgun at her son, and she was worried he'd come back because he had a lot of weapons. At the same time, Cruz himself dialed 911 to give his version of events.
The thing is, I lost my mother a couple of weeks ago, so I'm dealing with a bunch of things right now.
The Broward County Sheriff has announced 2 of his officers are being investigated over the way they dealt with complaints about Cruz, and he revealed a difficult new development.
I'm Scott Peterson. I've been a police officer for 30 years.
A deputy on duty that day was filmed on a surveillance camera waiting outside the school building for 4 minutes without ever going in.
When the shooter was still inside the building?
Yes, he was.
And so what should he have done?
Went in, addressed the killer, killed the killer.
The deputy was suspended, then chose to resign. Although having armed personnel at the school didn't prevent the massacre, the policy President Trump appears to favor over all others is arming teachers to stop mass shootings in American schools.
well-trained, gun-adept teachers and coaches and people that work in those buildings, people that were in the Marines for 20 years and retired, people in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, people that are adept with weaponry and with guns. They teach. I mean, I don't want to have 100 guards standing with rifles all over the school. You do a concealed carry permit.
Well, in a moment, we'll be talking with the students from the school here in Parkland for their reaction to that, as well as their activism and how they're managing their grief. But first, just quickly, Melissa Falkowski, you're a teacher. The president is offering bonuses to anyone prepared to carry a gun at school. What are your thoughts?
I think the idea of it is totally ridiculous. I think it's misdirection. It's to take the focus off of talking about the real issue, which is, you know, common sense gun laws. And I think it introduces a whole host of problems. It introduces more problems than it solves.
Okay, Ms. Falkowski, thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back later in the programme, but for now, it's back to Kathy in London. Kathy.
Kylie, thanks very much.
Welcome back to Parklands. We've come here to hear directly from students and one of their teachers, all survivors of the mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School last week. Now, in a moment, we'll be talking to them about the friends that they've lost and about the campaigns, the movement that they have built that has emerged from their grief and their anger. But first, a reflection on what this last week has been.
That tougher gun laws do not decrease gun violence. We call BS! They say a good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun. We call BS! They say guns are just tools like knives and are as dangerous as cars. We call BS!
With the massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, the generation born of Columbine, the nation's first mass school shooting, is finding its voice.
Yeah, we just need to make our presence felt, and then that's how change will start to begin.
Teenagers all across Florida this week seized their placards and walked out of their classrooms to make sure America is listening. They are now a movement, united by an intimate, heartbreaking knowledge of the damage that can be wrought by a weapon built for war.
How many of them endured? Not one, not two, but 7, 8, some of them 9 gunshot wounds on a single person. Each bullet after piercing through jeans and flesh, leaving behind it an unsurvivable gunshot wound. Enough is enough! Enough is enough!
The president says he's listening. He declared he was open to ideas when he hosted parents and students affected by school shootings past and present in the White House on Wednesday. But by Thursday, he decided the more guns, the better. But this time in the hands of the teachers.
And what I'd recommend doing is the people that do carry, we give them a bonus. We give them a little bit of a bonus. So practically for free, you have now made the school into a hardened target.
It's an interesting choice of phrase. Here's the president of the National Rifle Association the same afternoon saying virtually the same thing.
We must immediately harden our schools. Every day, young children are being dropped off at schools that are virtually wide open, soft targets for anyone bent on mass murder.
The students are determined to unseat politicians whose votes they say the gun lobby has bought, whether you're in the White House or the Florida State House, because right now, they say, the laws are absurd.
And it's harder for me to grip on a bottle from a liquor store till I'm 21, to rent a car till I'm 25, to run for office till I'm 25. It's just crazy how at 18 I can buy a concealed firearm, which is designed to end your life.
Making history in this case means meeting with state representatives to look them in the eye and demand a change in gun laws. I can see you're a bit tearful, aren't you? I'm sorry.
I'm the mayor of the village of Key Biscayne in Miami, Florida, and I just can't believe that this happens over and over again and no action has been taken. So I'm here in support of these wonderful children.
Why are you feeling so emotional at the moment? Are you impressed by their courage?
I am. And I'm moved at the loss. I mean, this is unacceptable.
The grief of Parkland echoes well beyond the confines of this small Floridian town. The friends and family of the 17 students and teachers who died here not only bearing their loss, but now fighting for other students and teachers in other American towns and cities never again to face such terror. If they can succeed where so many others have failed, perhaps that might bring a kind of comfort. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming to speak to us today. I know it's been an immensely traumatic time. We've seen your faces and heard you speaking as part of your campaigning, but of course, at the same time, you're all dealing with grief and loss, some of you of very close friends. I think there have been 17 funerals now held, so it's a very intense introduction to to death and to that process. Nikita, I know, you're a senior. You have a friend who died, who was killed that day. How are you managing? How are your friends managing?
Well, I've been trying to take my mind off it as much as possible. I've been speaking to the media. I've been doing interviews. I think the only way to get through it is to have some sense of accomplishment that my friend's death and the other 16 people's death wasn't in vain and it wasn't for nothing. Like, it's the only thing that we can do at this point. And I think it's important that we celebrate their lives in this way.
And Melissa, we spoke last week. You just left, I think, the first of the funerals that were held. And in that moment, I think we realized even then that the conversation might turn very quickly to teachers and guns and the idea of arming teachers. Now, Delaney, you were in Melissa's class that day and took cover under her instructions inside the classroom. Was there any moment when you thought, I kind of wish there was someone here to defend me with a gun?
Not for a single moment did I think that we would be safer if a teacher had a gun. There is no part of me that thinks that that would solve anything, because that wasn't her focus. Her focus was getting us into a safe hiding spot and keeping us from being noticed. It was not getting into a shooting fight with another person. And there's just so many flaws that lie in that simple idea that it didn't even seem like a realistic possibility to me at the time, and it still doesn't.
You're all nodding. Do you all agree with Delaney, or are any of you thinking, well, under certain conditions perhaps it would be appropriate?
No, I agree with Delaney wholeheartedly. I don't think that having a teacher in a classroom would make any difference. The type of weapon that was used in our school, the AR-15, shot straight through the door. It could have, straight through the wall. So a teacher with a handgun wouldn't have made any difference, because he didn't go inside any of the classrooms. All of those shots that unfortunately killed our 17 classmates came from the halls, through the doors, through the walls. It wouldn't have made a difference, and I wouldn't have felt any safer.
I mean, one of the very difficult details, among the many difficult details of what happened last week, is that we've now learned that there was a sheriff's deputy outside the building. Now, he is someone who was carrying a weapon, and he plays that role on campus. I mean, Melanie, you were quite close by. You were in the next building. While you were in lockdown, did it enter your mind at any point that there was someone at the school with a weapon who might be able to stop this?
Well, I know that there was an armed guard on campus. I even saw him when I walked outside after the fire alarm was pulled. I even saw him with his gun drawn on a golf cart heading towards the freshman building. But now after hearing the fact that he just stood outside for 4 minutes and didn't even enter the building, now it almost seems pointless. If you're going to arm teachers and guards at the school, they might as well do something. Because if you arm teachers, they might do the same thing. They might not even try to help.
So there's no circumstance under which any of you want...
I'm sorry. I think that just, if a trained professional, right, somebody who spent 33 years working for Broward Sheriff's Office was, I don't want to say unwilling or froze, because I don't know what the circumstances are, you know, then what, you know, a teacher who has maybe a few days training or a few weeks training, I think if a professional had a difficulty entering that building, I mean, in his mind, and he's hearing the shots, he must know that he's bringing a handgun, you know, to a confrontation that is not even. And so, I mean, I can't speculate as to what was in his mind, but I mean, that makes me think, you know, this whole argument about the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, I mean, that sort of, you know, throws that whole argument out the window, because here's a trained police officer who, for whatever reason, didn't enter that building. And so the idea of arming me, you know, as if I'm going to enter that building too, I mean, it's just not, it's illogical.
There has been a real focus on school security since last week, and a lot of politicians are embracing that idea. Indeed, the president has a real focus on that.
Yeah.
Now, he's also, I mean, he's been talking about something which is part of how a school at the moment defends itself against the idea of a school shooter, and that is active shooter drills. So the kind of lockdown that the school goes under. You have an alert. Can you explain to me how they work? Perhaps you, Susanna, what happens in those kind of code red situations?
So for code red situations, really what we have is we have small windows in the doors of our classrooms. So our teachers were instructed to cover those like all the time, but it covers part of the room from view. So students are directed to go to the part of the room that's not visible through that slit in the window, and we're directed to hide, take cover, cover our heads, and we're also directed to go into the closet in the case that the classroom has one and that there's enough room for everyone.
Let's just hear, the president has been talking himself about those active shooter drills today. Let's just hear what he's had to say.
Active shooter drills is a very negative thing. I'll be honest with you. I mean, if I'm a child and I'm 10 years old and they say, we're going to have an active shooter drill, I say, what's that? Well, people may come in and shoot you. I think that's a very negative thing to be talking about, to be honest with you. I don't like it. I'd much rather have a hardened school. I don't like it. I wouldn't want to tell my son that you're going to participate in an active shooter drill. And I know some of them actually call it that. I think it's crazy. I think it's very bad for children.
And I think
I mean, what's your response to that? Do you think that these active shooter drills effectively save lives?
Yes.
You do? Do you all believe that it's something that in that moment's made you safer?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Can we move on to, I mean, there are lots of other measures being discussed, among them a whole raft of gun laws, certainly more perhaps by you than by some of the politicians you've been meeting with. Before we begin this conversation, we have to talk about the Second Amendment, because it is the core principle that prevails in any conversation about gun laws in America. Now, you're all at high school, you know all about the American Constitution and the Second Amendment. Give me a bit of a sense of what the Second Amendment says.
Yeah, so the Second Amendment, basically a lot of people know it as the right to bear arms. But if you look a little bit deeper into it, it was created so that people could keep and preserve a well-regulated militia during a time where the United States did not have a centralized military. But now that's not the case. You know, now the United States has a centralized military, and in fact, it's one of the largest militaries in the world. So the Second Amendment, a lot of people, you know, now they're arguing that it's a bit redundant. You know, it's not necessary.
But the proponents of the Second Amendment, or defenders of the Second Amendment, indeed as they see themselves, would say that there is a political push by people after shootings like the Parkland shooting to use this kind of legislation to come and take away their guns. They believe the government is coming to take away their guns. You are, in a way, in the sense that don't you indeed want to take some guns out of circulation in America?
I'd like to chime in on this. Again, the Second Amendment, it was made in the 1700s, starkly different world than what happens today. We didn't have these semi-automatic assault weapons and rifles, all of these weapons. So if we actually take action about what we need to do, and that's saving lives, then we need to do it now.
How many of you want an assault weapons ban?
I mean, I would just add too,
I mean, I'm allowed to drive a car, but there's all kinds of regulations on it. So, you know, the Second Amendment says you have a right to bear arms. Okay, but let's start talking about what do we want those guns to be? What do we want that to look like? No one's saying that you can't have a gun, but I think we have to look at, you know, what would you need an AR-15 for? Like in your regular everyday life, why do you need that? No one has answered that question or has even broached that question.
But you would still describe yourselves as people who support the Second Amendment. Each of you individually support the right to bear arms. Sorry, go on.
Everyone should definitely have the right to be able to protect their home, but no one needs an AR-15 in order to protect their home. To protect your home, you need a handgun or a pistol. There is no purpose that an AR-15 serves other than to kill people.
Delaney, what were you going to say?
What we've been saying time and time again is we're not trying to take away guns from the people who we know can keep their handguns and their rifles. Our intention is to keep guns from falling into the hands of people like this shooter, people who are not stable, who are not in the place to own and possess a firearm. That is our intention here. We're not taking away guns from those who can handle having a gun. And if you are so desperate about it, if it is that horrible to you to imagine life without a gun, there seems to be some sort of reevaluation that needs to take place there of what your priorities are.
And I would also like to point out, we already have infringements on the Second Amendment, and this is what I talked to lawmakers about on Monday. Basically, we already have an age requirement. Our own governor today said that age requirement is going to be moved from 18 to 21.
Indeed.
Certain types of weapons are already banned, so why can't we move it further just to save lives? Because as Melanie said, it's just this type of weapon, the AR-15, is just meant to kill people or kill things, you know. So if we get rid of them, it would really save lives in the long run.
We're going to take a break, but we'll reflect more on some of those new measures that you were speaking about. Florida's governor has in fact announced a whole raft of new measures. Some of the measures that these people have been campaigning for. We'll talk to you about how you feel about that, but back in a few moments. So in Parkland, we're here talking to some of the students and a teacher from the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the location of that mass shooting last week. One thing that we haven't spoken about is your generation, in a way. You were born around the time that the Columbine school shooting happened. And I'm guessing you were in your early teens, is that right, when Sandy Hook happened?
Yeah, I was 12. I was 12.
You were 12?
I was 12.
And you were 12 as well. So do you remember that moment as a 12-year-old? Do you remember learning about that? Do you remember what you thought about that?
I remember just watching a lot of the media coverage that was on it and kind of learning, you know, what had transpired in the events and the fact that the people who are in there in the school listening to the shots, you know, they're terrorized by that. And, you know, they had to live with that. And so many children, you know, 26 children had been shot. And, you know, for me, it's unfathomable that when something like that happened, people didn't rise to the occasion and our politicians didn't rise to the occasion and decide that, you know, this type of weapon is not necessary in our society today.
I guess that's a critical question, isn't it, going forward, in the sense that, you know, tragically after Columbine there were calls and campaigns for changes, nothing happened. After Sandy Hook there were calls and campaigns for changes, nothing happened. I mean, we were here in Orlando nearly 2 years ago, another mass shooting in a nightclub, 49 people killed. Again, campaigns for the same kind of thing, and nothing happened. I wonder, what do you think makes you different? Where do you think you can be successful, where perhaps people in your position weren't before?
We're in a place where we are, of course, we come from an affluent community. As we've said, Parkland was long considered the safest city in Florida. Many of us, I personally, came to Stoneman Douglas because it was a better school. I moved to go to a better school.
It has a great reputation.
It has a great reputation as a very good educational system. So we are in a place where we are privileged enough to be educated, to know what we're talking about. And that has been such a huge tool for us to know how to speak out and how to do it eloquently, because we have that ability, and we're teenagers. We know how to use social media to our advantage. We speak the digital language, and we're using it. We are absolutely using it as a huge platform for us to give our thoughts without them being in any way edited by the media, because that is a thing that has to happen. But we're using our platforms, we're using our knowledge, we're using our status as victims, the people who are directly affected, in ways that haven't been used before.
I mean, let's talk some more about that activism, as well as the kind of social media activism that you're talking about and the national platform that you've assumed. I mean, a number of you went to Tallahassee, so the state capital here in Florida, earlier in the week. to address directly lawmakers and to push for some changes. Now, of course, Rick Scott, the governor, has today announced what those changes will be. Included among them are some of your core demands, so raising the minimum age for access to weapons from 18 to 21. He's dedicated a certain amount of money to mental health programs, and he's talking about potentially building a kind of an early warning system or a gun violence restraining order. So if someone is threatening to use their weapons, a family or a friend can go to the police and those weapons can be taken away. Is that what, I mean, given that you all went and you've come away and this has happened just a few days later, is that an encouraging development for you?
Absolutely. It's definitely a step in the right direction. And I'm very glad to see now that Governor Rick Scott took into consideration our suggestions and our demands in his proposal. However, I don't think any of us will be assured until that proposal is passed as a bill.
Right. I mean, there's still the politics of Florida to deal with, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you, when we talk about activism, one of the side effects of that, certainly in the US, and I think peculiarly in the US when it comes to mass shootings, are these kind of conspiracy theories that emerge. Oh, yes. Now, it's kind of difficult to, as an outsider, to understand where this comes from, but it's certainly something that other families and friends, for example, in Sandy Hook, have been really troubled by, where basically there's a suggestion that the whole thing is a hoax. I mean, who can explain to me how these conspiracy theories, like, what are they saying?
I've been, my social media following has grown a lot because of the exposure that we've had, and with that growth comes, of course, droves and droves of people who are hating and trolling on us and calling me a crisis actor, calling me heartless, calling me coached, deranged even. And it's, of course it gets to a degree like where it seems a bit hurtful, but ultimately we know that these people, they're just complaining. They're not doing anything. These are the people who are, they're sitting in front of their computers and they're typing out hate, but they're not taking action. We're the ones taking action, and we are gaining so much support that, all we can do is look over it. If we engage with them, that's just going to make us look immature.
I think our politics has descended into this sort of like shouting at each other without actually listening and name calling, and on both sides, you know, on both the liberal and the conservative side. And so, you know, it's an excuse not to listen, because if they can discredit Delaney and they can discredit David Hogg, then they don't have to listen to the other side. I think the pleas that are coming from these kids are so emotional and they're so raw and they're so powerful, and then people want to be, I mean, honestly, that's the best counter to the argument they can come up with, is that they're planted and they're fake because they don't want to listen. They just don't, if that makes it easier for them not to address the issues that we want to talk about.
I mean, I understand that you're using your platforms very effectively to push back against these ideas, but I mean, Melanie, on some level it must feel quite hurtful given what you've been through. You know, some students are getting death threats.
I mean, I've never heard of students getting death threats, and honestly, I am not hurt at it at all. I think people just happen to be surprised at how articulate and well-spoken the students of this generation are. You know, I don't think they were expecting millennials and Gen Z students to be as intelligent as they've proven to be, and I think accusing them of being crisis actors is their only way that they can really explain that.
Something interesting that I saw was it was one of the shows that I was watching, and they were talking about the crisis actor situation, and they said, you can't say these things to real people and not be heartless, not be cruel, but if they aren't real, then there's no guilt there. There's no realization that, wow, the things that I'm saying are so wrong and so abhorrent that I am a bad person. So these people are using it almost as a shelter.
So to Melissa's point, you don't need to have the argument about guns if none of it is real.
Because it's not real, it's all made up, so we don't even have to talk about it.
I mean, if we're going to talk about guns, we should also talk about the National Rifle Association. Now, the NRA have become, certainly in your campaign, a real target, and certainly kind of breaking that linkage between the NRA and politicians. I mean, why is that so important, do you think, Nikita, that should happen?
I mean, our government is filled with corruption and money, and the politicians are more likely to listen to interest groups and big corporations than they are to listen to their constituents and their delegates. And I think that's an idea that betrays the foundations on which our democracy was created. And it's important for us to speak out against that and to lessen the hold of interest groups and corporations on the government as much as possible.
Isn't there an underlying issue, though, in the sense that a lot of people choose to vote for NRA-backed politicians because they're Second Amendment proponents and they want the politicians who are going to protect their Second Amendment rights? So the NRA might make that relationship slightly more easier, make it easier to vote for these people, but they reflect a critical mass of opinion, certainly in this state and many other American states.
I believe that a politician can support the Second Amendment without being funded by the NRA, because being funded by the NRA means that it is not their policies, it is not their platform, but it is the platform of an organization that is backed by millions of dollars. That is ultimately, that is what it is. You can vote for a politician that supports the Second Amendment, that supports reasonable gun laws, and will protect your rights. But they don't have to be funded by the NRA. That is our goal here, to make them realize that that is corruption in its very definition.
Yeah, and I think it's even more complicated than that too, because there are subset of voters that vote on that particular issue, and the way in some of our states that the districts are drawn in such a way so that there are more conservatives in one area, and so that different politicians can hold on to different areas and keep their seats. So I think it's even more complicated, even just beyond the money. That comes into play as well.
Yeah. Can I ask you briefly, because we're going to have to finish soon, but you're going back to school next week, or the school is reopening. I know it reopened for teachers today. I mean, how do you feel about that? Is there a desperation about trying to get back to a sense of normalcy, or are you worried?
I think it's really important for us to go back to school because it's all part of the healing process, and seeing our friends and seeing our teachers in the environment which we were there for 3 years, and I refuse to let one day and one killer ruin my 3 years and my 4 years that I spent at Stoneman Douglas.
Suzanne, what are you feeling?
Just really in general, you can't let this one person ruin your experience at high school I've made so many memories at, and I want to graduate from Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and I'm determined to do so. And if you don't go back to school, I understand if some people don't choose to, but I think you're letting the killer win, and we just can't do that.
I'd like to agree exactly with Nikita and Susanna said, but I also wanted to elaborate on what Dimitri said as well about Governor Rick Scott's actions. And this is a good first step, but we have to understand that this could happen anywhere, not just at schools. So until that our politicians acknowledge that the problem is with guns, not just with the other issues, then this could happen again.
Is the activism going to have to take a back seat when you go back to school?
No.
I don't think it's, I mean,
No.
I was
I
was at school today and talking to some of the teachers, and I'm pretty sure that all our focus from here on out is going to be on encouraging the kids' activism. We've talked about how the curriculum is probably going to be suspended. I mean, we don't really know because there's no sort of like guidebook for like how you go back to school after this happens to you. But that's one of the things we've been talking about is like the kids want to be involved and they want to be active, and I think that's where we're going with everything we do this year.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for being so candid and for sharing your views with us. Best of luck in your continuing campaign. But thank you very much for joining us. That's goodbye from us and goodbye from London.